Switzerland began as a group of tiny municipalities that stood up to loyal power, who ended up as one of the most prosperous countries in Europe despite being landlocked. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Switzerland. Archaeologists suspect that people have been living in what is now Switzerland for at least 30,000 years, and have found evidence of human occupation in the Middle End from at least 10,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age. Ancient Switzerland's most famous prehistoric people, however, are the Hallstatt and Latin cultures, Proto-Celtic tribes that seem to have originated here and spread throughout Europe. The earliest written records of people living in Switzerland, meanwhile, start in the 3rd century BCE, which is when the Romans began to expand into the area. The first were the Insubers, a Celtic people who lost their fight against Rome in what is now southern Ticino in 222 BCE. The next incorporation came around a century later when the territory of the Allobroges, a Gallic people that lived around what is now Geneva, fell into Roman control. Then, around 61 BCE, the Helvetii, a Celtic people under the leadership of Vercingetorix, decided to leave their home in the Swiss plateau and move into modern French territory as a result of the migration pressure from the Germanic tribes in the north. Unfortunately for them, they came into conflict with Julius Caesar, who quickly beat them at the Battle of Bibracte in 58 BCE, and sent them back to what is now western Switzerland with the status of foederati, allies bound by treaty to provide military assistance. Rome then turned their attention to the Raetians, a group of people that might have been related to the Etruscans, who the Romans conquered by 15 BCE, founding a number of settlements along the way, including Julia Equestris, now Nyon, and Augusta Raurica in 44 BCE. The latter is today the most famous archaeological site in Switzerland. Over the next 50 years, Roman Emperor Augustus and later Tiberius would incorporate the entirety of what is now Switzerland, dividing it into multiple provinces over time, the most important of which were Germania Superior for its western side and Raetia for its central and eastern sides. A Pax Romana would follow that would last several centuries, which would result not only in the first ever building of roads over Alpine passes like the Grand St. Bernard and the Via Claudia Augusta, some of which you can still see the remnants of, but also in a cultural assimilation that extended to all levels of society. Urbanization also became important. The largest town was Aventicum, the capital of Raetia, near the modern town of Avange. But there was also Turicum, which is now Zurich, Luzona, which is now Lausanne, and Genava, which is now Geneva. Rome's order and prosperity in what is now Switzerland came to an end when the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander in 235 AD created a major breakdown of authority in the empire, what historians refer to as the crisis of the 3rd century. In 260, when part of its western side, what became known as the Gallic Empire, briefly seceded from Rome, its emperor, Gallenus, withdrew the Rhine's legions to stop an usurpation challenge, leaving the Swiss plateau unprotected and prompting the Alemanni, a confederation of Germanic tribes, to quickly occupy the area, reducing the once prosperous Roman province into an impoverished frontier region. Emperors Diocletian and Constantine would rebuild some fortifications with a line of watchtowers protecting the area running from modern Basel to Geneva, but the vast majority of the Roman province would never recover. In 401, Stilicho, a Roman commander, withdrew all troops from the Rhine and Danube, marking the traditional end of Roman authority in Switzerland. In the following century, multiple peoples would come to inhabit what is now Swiss territory. The Burgundians, an original Germanic tribe, would settle in the west, adopting both the Christianity and the Latin language of the local Gallo-Roman tribes. The Alemanni, tribes from the north, settled the forests of central and northeastern Helvetia, halting their advances at points where the land was already populated by Latin-speaking Burgundians. They had little contact with the Romans or Christianity, unlike the Lombards, yet another Germanic tribe who would find a home in the south, or the Romansh, the inhabitants of the southeastern side of the country. As a result, a language pattern would develop that persists to this day, with French, German, Italian, and Romansh still spoken along these geographic parameters. In the meantime, yet another Germanic tribe, the Franks, under King Clovis, had been busy conquering their former Roman province of Gaul in the late 5th century. His sons continued these efforts and in 533 conquered Burgundy and with it the western side of modern Switzerland. 3 years later, they would do likewise with Alemanni lands, incorporating the entire Swiss region into the Frankish Empire. The Franks brought Latin Christianity, founding a series of monasteries like those of St. Gallen in 747, St. John in Munster in 780, Einsiedeln in 934, and rebuilding some like that at Romainmortier, which were then used as bases to project authority. In 814, the most famous of the Frankish kings, Charlemagne, died, paving the way for a civil war under his son Louis the Pious, and then an eventual agreement to solve the crisis, the Treaty of Verdun. in 843. As part of the accord, the empire was split into three, a situation that created a line running through the middle of modern Switzerland, which placed the western side under the authority of Emperor Lothair I and within Middle Francia, while its eastern side was allocated to Louis the German as part of East Francia. Lothair's kingdom was not particularly stable, however, and would see multiple changes over the following century as the realm was further divided amongst its heirs. The Swiss part of East Francia, meanwhile, suffered a number of invasions from the Magyars, seeing the destruction of Basel in 917 and St. Gallen in 926, while the Saracens, a people from the Arabic Peninsula, ravaged Valais in 920 and sacked the monastery of St. Maurice in 939. These threats would not completely subside until King Otto I defeated the Magyars in 955, which also allowed him to unite the Swiss area under his control as part of what came to be called the Holy Roman Empire. Switzerland's remoteness and the gradual decline of the imperial power in the next few centuries allowed the rise of quasi-independent territories out of bailiwicks, however. This process enabled feudal dynasties including the Zeringa, Savoys, Kiburga, and Habsburgs to concentrate rudimentary administrative and judicial powers in their own hands by the beginning of the 13th century. They also expanded their power by founding monasteries in new cities such as Freiburg in 1157, Winterthur in 1157, and Bern in 1191, which provided secure stopping places for the increasing numbers of merchants participating in the rapidly expanding trade of Western Europe. Around 1220, the road over St. Gothard Pass was opened for traffic, making it the shortest route to Italy. This gave the strategic communities of Uri and Schweiz disproportionate importance to the imperial rulers, especially as luxury goods began making their way across the Alpine passes into northern Europe, which in turn earned them imperial rights known as Reichsfreiheit, which granted them autonomy in 1231 and 1240 respectively. Around the same time, the Zeringa and Kiburga lines died out, and after driving the Savoy back to the Vaud, the Habsburgs emerged as the dominant family in Switzerland. Not only was their original castle, built in 1020, strategically situated, but then one of their own, Rudolf I, was crowned King of Germany in 1273, an event that ended the Great Interregnum, the anarchy that had reigned in Germany for some 20 years. Rudolf's death in 1291 brought turmoil to the Swiss plateaus. Worried about losing their independence, the Valsdetta, worst cantons of Schweiz, Uri, and Unterweiden, created a defensive league formalized with a solemn oath at Rutli Meadow on August 1st of 1291. This agreement would bring about the Old Swiss Confederacy, the basis of modern Switzerland, as well as a number of uprisings against the Habsburgs. William Tell, the legendary folk hero most associated with the country, would be created a few centuries later as an embodiment of these revolts that would continue. In 1315, the Confederation's forces, basically an army of peasants, defeated the troops led by Leopold I, the Duke of Austria, at the Battle of Morgarten, which forced Ludwig of Habsburg to grant even more rights to the cantons. The Habsburgs then tried to force the burgeoning market town of Luzerne, transport hub for the journey to and from the Gothard Pass, to take up arms against its lakeside neighbors. Instead, Luzerne opted to join the Schweizers, enlarging the Confederation to 4 in 1332. Unable to bring the Swiss to heel, Habsburg bailiffs withdrew altogether in about 1350 and left the hard-nosed peasants to their own devices. The local economy would continue to flourish, and so would the Confederation. In the next 3 years, it would double the number of cantons to 8, with Zurich, Glarus, Zug, and Bern joining the Confederacy for their own distinct reasons. The new members strengthened the Confederation by providing additional labor, as well as political and strategic capacities that paved the way for yet more decisive military victories against the Austrian Habsburgs at the battles of Sempach in 1386 and Naples in 1388. This would mark the end of the wars against the Habsburgs and definitively create an independent state within the Habsburg Empire that was ruled uniquely by urban burghers and merchants and founded on principles of social cooperation, a very rare sight in Europe at the time. But the Confederation was not done expanding. In 1440, forces from Uri and Obwalden crossed the Gothard to seize the Valle Leventina south to Bellinzona, crushing the armies of the Dukes of Milan as they did so, while the Confederation took advantage of popular uprisings against the Abbot of St. Gallen to extend their influence eastwards, and of a dispute between Austria and Luxembourg to seize control of the fertile northern lands of Argau. It also gained Zugewandte, or formal allies, who were invited to take part in the Executive Council discussions and took part in multiple wars, including against Burgundy in 1476, which effectively ended the latter as a regional power after the Battle of Nunzi, and against the Swabian League in 1499, which convinced 2 other cantons to join the Confederation, Basel and Schaffhausen. This victorious streak against the large powers finally ended in 1515 when the French crossed the Confederation at the Battle of Marignano, just southeast of Milan, a clash that occurred as part of the Italian Wars, which themselves were part of a larger struggle for European domination between France and the Habsburgs. The defeat in generous surrender terms offered by the King of France had two important consequences. First, it made France a huge market for Swiss products until the French Revolution, which increased their prosperity. And second, it paved the way for a politics of neutrality, as it became clear that the Confederacy could not match the resources and efficiency of the surrounding united monarchies. Of course, there was one other factor that contributed to this, the Reformation. Begun by Martin Luther in 1517 in neighboring Germany, his ideas spread like wildfire, including in Switzerland, where Helfrich Zwingli, a lay priest from Zurich, expanded on Luther's questioning of the Catholic Church, and soon the Confederacy was divided along religious lines, which themselves had deeper divisions, particularly between urban and rural. That was because when cities overthrew the Catholic ecclesiastical authorities in places like St. Gallen, Basel, and Bern, each city gained new power and authority over its countryside, which naturally led to resentment. When Zwingli tried to reorganize the Confederacy under the twin city leadership of Zurich and Bern, it prompted armed conflict in 1529 and 1531. Known as the Kapo Wars. In the first, the spread of violence was narrowly avoided, but in the second one, the Catholic forces marched on Zurich, killing some 500 troops, including Zwingli, who decided to join as a chaplain. This would end up gaining Catholics a right of veto in the Diet and making Switzerland a two-religion country, but also one that would have a harder time employing unified military actions as it had done in the past. In the meantime, the Confederacy would get a new member. In 1526, Geneva joined the Swiss after managing to win their independence from the House of Savoy with the help of Bernese forces. Within a decade, French priest John Calvin settled in the city, making it one of the spiritual centers of Protestantism and helping maintain religious balance, especially as the Counter-Reformation gained traction in Southern Europe. It was only shared economic interests that kept the Swiss Confederation together. A lucrative system of textile processing developed, in which merchants in the cities, generally Protestant, supplied raw materials to peasants in the countryside, generally Catholic, who worked up the finished product and delivered it back to the city merchants for trading on or export. Not that this stopped violence altogether. There were two peasant insurgencies in 1591 and 1653, and two religious wars in 1656 and 1712. The former were tax revolts which, although crushed, led authorities to grant much of the original demands of the rebels, as they realized that it would be better to keep the peace. The latter, meanwhile, would end Catholic supremacy in the Confederacy, but also the Swiss religious wars. Peace made an industrial revolution possible, where urban manufacturing industries such as watchmaking and textiles took root in the Northwest and the East respectively, especially as skilled artisans like the French Huguenots arrived in the cities, fleeing persecution elsewhere. City demand, in turn, spurred the development of commercial farming, bringing prosperity to rural areas as well. The increasing economic growth and the influence of liberal philosophies of people like Geneva native Jean-Jacques Rousseau led to growing intolerance of patrician rule and popular insurrections in Lausanne in 1723, Geneva in 1737 and again in the 1760s, Bern in 1749, as well as Ticino in 1755. Then, when the French Revolution happened in 1789, it spurred revolutionary demonstrations in Vaud and Staffel, which convinced the French to invade with the intention of creating sister republics. Napoleon's troops did just that in 1798, quickly overpowering the resistance. He then proceeded to promulgate a constitution that centralized power and declared a new state called the Helvetic Republic. Severe resentment against the changes and new taxes, however, prompted multiple anti-French insurgencies, forcing Napoleon to withdraw his troops in 1802 and instead pass an Act of Mediation in 1803, which restored cantonal power but retained French influence over the still client republic. It remained the law until after Napoleon's final European defeat at Waterloo in 1815. European powers restored Swiss independence at the Congress of Vienna that year, and even added to its territory when they allowed Valais, Neuchâtel, and Geneva to join the new confederation, thereby extending Switzerland to its current borders. The Congress of Vienna did two other things that would be crucial for the country's future. It formally established Switzerland's neutrality, which, coupled with a norm of secrecy that had started in the 18th century, attracted larger capital flows to its banks, and also restored some aristocratic control over Swiss politics, the latter of which would eventually lead to yet another liberal backlash. This time in 1830, when a process the Swiss called regeneration, brought on by popular upheaval, resulted in a number of cantonal constitutions that enshrined equality and political rights for all. Although the economy continued to grow at a good clip during this period, the simmering conflict between liberal and Protestant cities and the rural and Catholic cantons eventually exploded into armed conflict, the Sonderbund War of 1847. The immediate spark was a coalition that 7 conservative Catholic cantons created for themselves, the Sonderbund, or Separate Alliance, which the national legislature declared unconstitutional and then set troops to quash it, which it did in just a few weeks. This paved the way for the creation of Switzerland as a truly federal state under the Constitution of 1848. This still in effect legal framework in the country not only created the first Swiss central government with a directly elected bicameral parliament, but also divided power between the center and the cantons, which helped bring a sense of national reconciliation in the following decades. It helped that steady economic growth continued with railways, tourism, chemicals, engineering, and heavy industry becoming important components of the country's economy, and especially that there was further democratization with the adoption of proportional representation in cantonal elections and the growth of consultation and compromise at executive level in the federal government, with the creation of a referendum in 1874. Peace and prosperity also began cementing a Swiss nationality, which saw massive celebrations in 1891. When World War I hit, Switzerland maintained its neutrality, but local sympathies with the various combatants engendered heavy tensions between the Germanophobe Swiss and their French and Italian-speaking countrymen. It also cast a weighty burden on the working class, who as part of the militia army were mobilized for long periods to guard Switzerland's borders, but received no compensation for their loss of wages. Moreover, the working class was also hurt by the government's decision to finance defense efforts through the issue of currency, which caused a surge in inflation. This created serious social tensions that erupted at the end of the war with a massive national strike starting in Zurich in November 1918. Fearing a Soviet-style Bolshevik revolution, the federal government sent an army to suppress it, and within 3 days the strike leaders, many of whom were arrested, gave up without a fight. Nonetheless, one of their main demands, a 48-hour week, was granted by the government within a year. Another one of their demands, women's suffrage, would have to wait until 1971 when they gained it for federal elections. The Great Depression of the 1930s hurt Switzerland's prosperity like much of the rest of the world. It also encouraged the creation of a fascist front, who had one of their own, Robert Tobler, elected to parliament in 1935. But unlike other places, a severe devaluation in 1936 boosted exports, helping stabilize the economy, while an alliance between liberals and social democrats helped sideline authoritarianism. As the Nazis began to invade its neighbors and the likelihood of war continued to increase, Switzerland prepared to defend its neutrality. It increased defense spending and appointed Henri Guisan to the rank of general, an extremely rare position in the country, for the purpose of mobilizing against a potential invasion. Guisan mobilized hundreds of thousands, gave a famous speech in the Ruetli Plateau in 1940 that vowed never to surrender, and created a national redoubt plan that aimed to retreat the Swiss army to the Alps, from where they would continue the fight. Switzerland's treatment of Jews, on the other hand, was more mixed. On the one hand, it passed a law in 1934 that anonymized number bank accounts, aiming to protect the property of people being persecuted by the Nazis. Its people and charitable organizations also helped save Jewish refugees. Its government, however, had a very strict refugee policy that severely limited the number of Jewish people that could flee to Switzerland. During the entirety of the war, it only granted asylum status to 252 people. The rest of the nearly 300,000 refugees that came to the country during this period were either there temporarily, arrived in the last weeks of the war, or were allowed to live with the permissions of the cantons, not the federal government. Fortunately for Switzerland and the Jewish refugees that made it to safety, although Germany had plans to invade, it never did, busy as it was with other military plans. After the war, neutrality politics continued to be at the forefront of the country's foreign policy. Switzerland opted not to join the United Nations until 2002, and that was explicitly because of a referendum. It also refused to join NATO or the European Union. The post-war years, meanwhile, brought massive economic growth. Because Swiss industries had not been damaged by the war, they were able to immediately provide the inputs necessary to rebuild Europe, which allowed industrial productivity to soar, which in turn attracted immigrants to the country, an issue that would become increasingly divisive in the 21st century. Its educated workforce and financial industry, meanwhile, allowed it to maintain its edge, multiplying their GDP per capita around 24 times from 1970 until 2025, outpacing similarly rich European countries. And while Swiss neutrality has been more pragmatic and accommodating since 2010, with increasing cooperation with the EU and international organizations, the country remains proudly exceptional. Not bad for a place that began as a bunch of Alpine passes trying to work together for their common good.